and go into why is this happening? How is it possible that so many people can be made to agree to these kinds of medical interventions? We have two experts for this. One is Meredith Miller, and the other one is Ariane Bilheran, both of whom know a lot about psychology. Who wants to start? Meredith, I'm sorry to keep you waiting for so long.
No worries. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. So for the last 2 years, we have witnessed around the world the same patterns of abuse dynamics that we see in interpersonal relationships. And I'm speaking in terms of psychological abuse, which is mostly invisible, yet very real, insidious, and pervasive in the life of an individual who's been targeted. So over the years of working with clients who are victims and survivors of abuse, only a small percentage of the people that I've worked with experienced physical abuse. Those who experienced physical abuse as well as psychological abuse told me that in the long run, the psychological abuse was far more damaging to them in their entire life. This is not to minimize physical abuse. This is to emphasize how damaging psychological abuse can be. So my understanding of psychological abuse comes from a lifetime of immersion experience in these environments, in the family, in relationships, and studying and working for 16 years in holistic healing and coaching. So in the last 6 years, I've specialized in a micro niche called narcissistic abuse, which is predominantly psychological abuse. And over working with these people, I've had the opportunity even to work with some people with PhDs, some in psychology, and also with some licensed psychotherapists who told me they didn't see it in their own life. They didn't see the patterns of the abuse, and that they also didn't learn how to recognize psychological abuse in their training programs. So today I want to talk about the two most important concepts from my perspective to understand in order to understand the individual experience who's been targeted by abuse in terms of what we're dealing with when people fall into the narrative, or even when evidence and information and truth is coming out and people continue to grab onto the narrative. Why would people choose to ingest an experimental substance, but also why would they comply with the narrative in general? And at the very end, I want to bring up a study from Yale University from 2020 that's going to bridge what Brian Garish was talking about last weekend. He was talking about the applied behavioral psychology. He brought up a study that was done, and he said that it could be used to change the way that people think and feel and behave. And so this Yale University study from 2020 basically gives us the keys to understanding the particular emotional manipulation tactics that they use. Now, they don't call it emotional manipulation. They call it COVID-19 vaccine messaging. And I'm not going to speak about the science because that's not my field. My field is recognizing the red flags of emotional abuse and manipulation. So that's what I'm going to speak on. So the first concept to understand about abuse is the cognitive dissonance. This is a survival mechanism that happens. So let's say a person has been cultivated to believe in a certain worldview or perspective or this narrative that was launched in 2020. And then all of a sudden you present to them some evidence or information that contradicts everything that they've believed up until then. The person is going to be unable to reconcile this conflict in their mind and in their brain. And what's going to happen is a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety on the nervous system, which triggers the amygdala circuit and almost a short circuit or hijacking of the brain, and the person goes into denial. So they won't be able to see that evidence. That's why as the truth more is coming out, people simply can't look at it. They might get angry at the messenger. They might simply turn away or cut somebody out of their life because they're trying to show them some evidence. Some people might be a little more aware of their cognitive dissonance. And when you try to show them the evidence, they might even tell you, I can't look at that because if what you're saying is true, I can't exist in a world like that. So this is the nature of cognitive dissonance. And this is what keeps people in this brain fog. And in the brain fog of the cognitive dissonance, that inner conflict, it's very difficult to think. So people have a very difficult time with cognitive processes, with critical thinking. And what they want to do is see the good in the abuser, in the perpetrator. So the second survival mechanism that happens is similar to cognitive dissonance, but more complex. Cognitive dissonance, from my perspective, is sort of like a level one. It's this conflict that happens in the dissonance in the brain. The level two is the Stockholm syndrome. There are more complex dynamics taking place here. So in interpersonal relationships, we typically call this a trauma bond, but with strangers, we call it Stockholm syndrome. The same mechanisms are taking place in the human brain and neurological system. So what's happening with Stockholm syndrome is there are 4 parameters, and I'm going to explain these in a very clear way that people can understand how this relates to what they've experienced and what they've witnessed in other people. And I'm going to give some examples too of how we've seen these 4 parameters show up in real life since 2020. So the very first one is isolation, and this could be either physical and or psychological isolation. The most important key here is that the person is isolated from outside perspectives. They can only have the perpetrator's narrative. So the perpetrator will make sure that they don't have access to outside perspectives, because this keeps a person completely subscribed to that narrative. So what scientists have discovered is that after a period of prolonged isolation, what happens is that chronically elevated stress levels begin to change a person's neurological system, changing then their ability to form social bonds, and even causing irritability and aggression when they're given a chance to participate in social situations. So the state that's caused after the isolation, the prolonged isolation, is disconnection. Disconnection in the polyvagal theory triggers the sense of unsafe. A person begins to feel unsafe when we're not socially connected. We are mammals. We rely on social connection in order to feel safe at a neurological level. So how the isolation played out in the world, there's been the domestic confinement, for example, where people were told to stay home with minimal social opportunities. And then how were they isolated by the perpetrator's narrative was through the technology. So in order to understand the individual experience, we also have to look at the environment in which the individual exists. And that is in a world of increasing technological dependence. So an individual is at home and they're constantly connected to their cell phone, to the internet, to the TV. They're listening to mainstream media. They're going on social media, and they're constantly bombarded with the repetition of that message. Even on corporations, there's a coordinated corporate messaging, repeating those same catchphrases that we're hearing from public officials and through the mainstream media. Even going shopping at a corporate grocery store, you're walking around the store at Walmart or Kroger, and in the background, constantly assaulting your subconscious, are the loudspeakers telling you those same messages about staying 6 feet apart and wearing your mask and getting vaccinations. And so in order to control a person's exposure to outside perspectives, what have we seen? We've seen censorship, silencing, propaganda, fact-checking, silencing, shaming, and smearing anybody providing that outside perspective. So this is essentially how the isolation phase took place. So the next phase of the Stockholm syndrome is the perceived acts of kindness. And this is part of the abuse cycle. So in an abusive relationship, it's going to go back and forth between idealization and devaluation, some sort of reward and then punishment. And so we call this intermittent reinforcement. And it goes back and forth. The perceived act of kindness is the idealization part. And so what that does is that causes a person to relax their guard, to begin to trust the perpetrator. And then the intermittent reinforcement and the intermittent reward causes a person to work harder to get that reward, to invest more in that relationship or that life situation, and to develop an almost obsession with compliance based on the hope of getting that reward. So the state that a person goes into due to this perceived act of kindness, and the key word here is perceived, because this isn't kindness coming from an abuser, it's a manipulation. But the nervous system and the person perceives it as an act of kindness. So the state that's caused here is almost an addiction to that hope, an addiction to the hope that this will be the time that they get the reward, or this will be the time that change for good happens. So how has this played out? Well, we've gone through phases of lockdowns and then some restoration of some freedom, some loosening of restrictions, and then lockdowns again, and then back and forth. We've been through this cycle multiple times since 2020. Currently, the trends around the world in many places, again, we're coming into this perceived act of kindness. We're hearing some governments are dropping some regulations. So what's going to happen? People's hopes are getting up again. They're going to be hoping that, oh, this is finally it. We're going back to normal. And that's the thing that every victim in an abusive relationship is hoping to get back to the good times. So what we hear in society is people are hoping to get back to normal. Other acts of perceived kindness, we've seen so many, the free vaccine. We've also seen in America lotteries in some states, get vaccinated and win $50, $100, up to $1 million in some states. Other states offering French fries, donuts, guns, trucks. You can even get a free lap dance from a stripper in Las Vegas if you get your vaccine at that place. We've also seen mortgage and student loan forbearance, allowing people time to put that off. And we've heard promises of safety. It's for your good. It's because we care. These are perceived acts of kindness. And also, and this is a key, little bits and dosing of truth. So this perceived act of kindness is dosed periodically, almost like a drug, through the relationship or the situation. And so when they disclose little bits of truth and they let little bits of truth leak out, what happens, we get our hopes up again that finally the truth is coming out and we're going to be able to move on and move past this. So then the third parameter of the Stockholm syndrome is a perceived life threat. So now we're getting into more serious state. So the nervous system, perceived is again the key word. When the autonomic nervous system perceives a cue of life threat in the environment, the person is automatically locked into an autonomic state of collapse. And this is over a period of time. This doesn't happen the first time. It happens after bombardment and shock trauma of fear messaging repeated over, and the imagery that they've shown, utterly terrifying people. So over a period of time of that terror, what happens is the autonomic nervous system will immediately go into a state of immobilization. So in the state of immobilization, a person feels frozen. They may dissociate. They might check out, not really be present. So they're not really paying attention. They're in sort of an automaton behavior, which makes compliance and control a lot easier. And so also the brain fog that kicks in, and even a metabolic shutdown. So as the nervous system goes into this state of autonomic collapse, they may also go into metabolic shutdown. Now, the interesting thing is this state also leads a person to decreased immunity. Now, that's very interesting to notice because we're in a pandemic. And when a person is triggered into this state by the autonomic nervous system, endogenous opioids are also released in the body, which cause the person to stay numb. So that's helpful when a person is going through a lot of pain, but then that becomes maladaptive because that numbness keeps a person locked in this state. So it's very difficult to do anything, to take any action, because they are neurologically immobilized. So why are people so afraid? On one side, we've seen the messaging of the fear of the virus and also the fear of other people who they've been conditioned to believe are dangerous and diseased. And on the other side, a lot of people have become very afraid of the tyranny that's happening. So the fourth and final parameter of the Stockholm syndrome is a perceived inability to escape. So the person is in this state of collapse for a while, and this goes on and on and on over a period of time. They become exhausted. They have no energy to try anything, to strive for anything. They go into a state what we call learned helplessness, which is also known as debility, dependency, dread, which causes apathy. And in this state of apathy, debility, and dread, a person starts to become hopeless. They feel utterly powerless over their life. They feel like everything is out of control. And what happens is when they're locked into this state, this very low state of consciousness, they don't even have access to the fight or flight system. It takes more energy. They don't even have the energy to fight or flight here. So they certainly don't have access to the higher states of consciousness, like critical thinking, the intellectual brain, or even things like imagination. So if a person cannot imagine the way out, how are they ever going to get out? And it's not that a person has to be locked behind prison doors. Most abuse victims walk out their door multiple times a day. They go to work, they go to school to pick up their kids, they do life, and they go back home, right? So it's the perceived inability to escape. And this person is so terrorized and so debilitated and so dependent on the abuser that they begin to believe that their survival is dependent on the perpetrator. They also lose complete capability for creativity and all of the beautiful things that make us human. And so what happens is in this state, it goes on and on and on. And over a period of time, this person becomes spiritually bankrupt. They lose all faith. And when all faith is lost, the only thing left is emptiness. And that word emptiness does not do justice for the feeling and the experience that a person has. It is the worst feeling that a human can have because you feel like you are untethered and lost and floating in the universe with no connection, no support, no promise for the future. And I think that a lot of people have been locked into this state. And so what happens is that people will escape into fantasy. So we've seen a huge increase in pornography. We've seen a huge increase in addictions, in overdoses, and we even see self-harm, huge increases in suicide. So why is this even possible? Because a lot of people's entire sense of reality is coming through the technology. It's coming through the media. It's coming through the social media. It's coming through contact with other people who are in this narrative. So this is a very difficult place. When a person is in this place, the mentality is, I can't. It's just everything is, I can't. So how can they possibly wake up? How can they possibly do anything other than what they're told by the abuser? And they learn that resistance is painful. So the example is the wife who experiences marital rape. And so she learns over a period of time that it's futile to resist and that resistance only leads to more pain. So just let him get it over with. And I've heard so many people say, I just wanted to get it over with. I just got my shot. You know, they're in this state. So the Stockholm syndrome really, it explains why people stay in abusive relationships or situations like this narrative, why people return, why people cannot see the evidence that's coming, why people are irrationally loyal to these abusers and perpetrators, and why people even develop empathy for them. So do I have a few more minutes to show the Yale study?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Oops, sorry. Oh, password, I'm so sorry. Oh no, it wants me to quit Zoom. I'm so sorry. This is on clinicaltrials.gov. If anybody wants to look this up, clinicaltrials.gov, COVID-19 vaccine messaging, NIH, US National Library of Medicine. This was done at Yale University in July of 2020. And what they did is they used emotional manipulation messages like personal freedom, economic freedom, self-interest, community interest, economic benefit, guilt, embarrassment, anger, trust in science, and not bravery. The interesting thing is that they tell us straight away what their outcome measures are. Their primary outcome measure is intention to get the COVID-19 vaccine. So they want to know what a person's intention is to get it after 3 months or after 6 months of it becoming available. The secondary outcome measures, number one, vaccine confidence. So they want to know how much trust people can have or how they can influence people's trust in the vaccine. Number two, persuade others. So they want to know a person's willingness to persuade others to take the vaccine. Number three, fear of those who have not been vaccinated. Number four, social judgment of those who do not vaccinate. And they give you 4 items to measure the judgment of this person. Their trustworthiness. So if you don't get it, you're not trustworthy. Selfishness. If you don't get it, you're selfish. Likeableness. If you don't get it, you're not likable. And competence. If you don't get the vaccine, you're not competent. So they want to get people intended to get the vaccine. They want people's trust in the vaccine. They want people to persuade others to get it. They want people to be afraid of those who didn't get it. And they want people to socially judge those who didn't get the vaccine. And so that seems very clear that they're manipulating people about this vaccine. When we look at the messaging that they use, for example, trust in science, the premise here is that getting vaccinated against COVID-19 is the most effective way of protecting one's community. Vaccination is backed by science. If one doesn't get vaccinated, that means one doesn't understand how infections are spread or one who ignores science. The not bravery. For example, the frontline workers like firefighters and doctors are brave. Those who choose not to get vaccinated are not brave. Another one of the messaging that they've used, and this might already be ringing a bell to the jury who's thinking about the messaging that they've been hearing constantly for the last couple of years, community interest. So this message is about the dangers of COVID-19 to the health of loved ones. The more people who get vaccinated against COVID-19, the lower the risk that one's loved ones will get sick. Society must work together and all get vaccinated. So as I read through these, what I see is red flags. I even see gaslighting, which is the distortion of the perception of reality. For example, they say COVID-19 is wreaking havoc on the economy and people's economic freedoms. But that's actually not correct. It is the government regulations and restrictions and policies that are wreaking havoc on people's personal freedom and economic freedom and the economy. So I would love for any scientists to take a look at this study and see what they may want to say. I just wanted to speak about the red flags of abuse and manipulation. And I think that this study really provides that bridge to what Brian Garish was talking about, using the applied behavioral psychology. This is an example in action of how they've done that and how they've manipulated people into taking this, and not just taking it, but to do their bidding for them and to convince other people to get it.
When was this study conducted?
July 2020.
Can you send us a link to that study?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
I'm gonna send it, but you can move on if you.
I just want to get.
I'm trying to pull up my thing.
That's all right. That's all right. Go ahead, Dexter.
Yeah, I just want to, Ms. Miller, when it comes to the Yale study, and you've actually put quite a lot of emphasis on it, and I'm actually just trying to understand here as to who actually gave the instruction for the study to be conducted.
So
Do you perhaps know, or is it just an academic study that was conducted, or?
I'm going to put the link in the chat. Oh, it's disabled. So I'm going to send y'all the link. I'm not a scientist, so I'm a holistic coach. I help people heal after the abuse. I just recognize the red flags of abuse. I would like to see a scientist take a look at the study. All I've read is the front page that they've openly put out to the public. I'm sure that a scientist could take a look at that and dissect that in a very scientific way that could be helpful to answer your question.
Thank you.
Do you want to continue, Meredith, or are you taking...
That's all that I have, unless you have other questions.
We do have questions, but does it make sense to first hear Ariane?
Sure.
Okay, please go ahead, Ariane.
Thanks. I will read in English, porque my English is un poco awful. I am Ariane Bilheran from France. I am philosopher, specialized in philosophy of moral and politics. I am clinical psychologist and doctor in psychopathology, specialized in the study of manipulation, defiance of power, perversion, paranoia, harassment, and totalitarianism. So I will speak from those 2 points of view. I have taught for several years at the university in France. I have been an auditor and investigator for companies, but also an expert for courts in cases of harassment at work. I have published many books on this subject, some of which have been translated into languages other than French. In the situation we are dealing with, my expertise allows me to say that we are dealing with a totalitarian drift, and I will describe why I think so. This is a totalitarian drift from the point of view of political philosophy, but also from the point of view of psychopathology, which corresponds to a collective delusion, the paranoiac delusion. Paranoia is a contagious psychosis whose masterpiece is harassment, and which functions according to the following structure. A visible or invisible imaginary enemy persecutes us. We must go to war against the enemy, and this justifies the use of harassment, and all means are permitted. It is a delusion of persecution that leads to acting out. The intention to harm is nevertheless safeguarded, which is why I have in the past spoken out on the need for criminal convictions of paranoiac profiles, which are in the majority of cases at work in harassment. In the totalitarian system, the content of the delusion may change. For example, who is the designated enemy, but the structure remains the same, the one I just told you. First point, my diagnosis, harassment used against populations with terrible consequences on the mental health of individuals. In the political crisis we are dealing with, typical methods of harassment were used on the people who were victims of repeated moral pressure in order intended to create and maintain a state of terror in the individual. The consequences are terrible for people's mental health. The least we can say is that mental health has not been at all at the heart of the concerns. On the contrary, the damage is considerable. Multiple traumas, depressions, suicides, psychological disorganization, addictions, mental confusion, psychiatric decompensations, especially of schizophrenic type. Many specialists are alarming us, especially concerning children. For example, in January 2021, the head of the child psychiatry department at Necker Hospital in Paris, Dr. Pauline Chast, spoke of an alarming increase in suicide attempts among children and young adolescents in several Parisian hospitals. Mental health disorders are also often factors and triggers of somatic disorders called psychosomatic, affecting the health of the individual. Right now, the end justifies the means, and the logic is sacrificial. It becomes acceptable to sacrifice individuals in the name of quantity, in the name of the greatest number, and the individual is deprived of his human rights. Moral considerations no longer enter into the discourse except to be used in terms of blackmail and manipulation. It would be for the good of the group that the individual should be sacrificed itself. As an example, children's schooling has been sacrificed in many countries of the world for the last 2 years with class closures, greater inequalities, those who have access to the internet and those who don't, brutal class closures, isolation of children leading to depressive ideas. In France, healthcare providers were fired because they refused to undergo experimental injections in a so-called pandemic context where the health system could not logically afford to suspend its staff. Any form of disagreement or even simple questioning encounters censorship and repression in the face of a dogmatic narrative that no one had the right to refute, despite the many paradoxes it contains. The French president has repeatedly called on the French people to sacrifice themselves to make efforts in the war against the virus. More globally, whole countries has been locked down, unable to deal with the economic lockdown, with millions of people falling into misery. With this sacrificial logic, individuals no longer count and can be used as objects of experimentation to the point of genocide. There are no longer any moral, legal, or spiritual limits. The method used are sectarian method. First, terror. An extremely dangerous virus is going to kill us. Two, sequestration, lockdown, restrictions of freedom of movement, and infringement of inalienable fundamental rights, such as freedom of movement, freedom of expression, etc. 3. Exclusion and mistreatment. Critical citizens are considered bad, even to the point of calling for murder in some political discourses. For example, in Italy, where personalities from journalism, politics, and medicine called for the segregation in trains between the vaccinated and the non-vaccinated, suggesting a thing around the neck for the non-vaccinated, with declarations wishing for the re-establishment of the gas chambers. Some people today have lost everything, jobs, livelihood, parental rights, etc., simply for being opponent of the policies to have been pursued. For example, the refusal of care, as well as the injection practiced without any discernment of individuals with regard to their diversity, are abusive practices that endanger human life without the states taking responsibility for them. In France, being subject to anaphylactic shock is not a criterion for not being subjected to injection. 4. Conflict of loyalty. Forcing individuals to make impossible choices, false choices, for example, between the right to work, to our means of subsistence, and the right to dispose of our own body. It's a false choice. 5. Hypnotic suggestions. In particular, something called the hypnotic seal, which induces prohibition of thinking in people through the mass media, with the repetition of deadly accounting discourses and images of panic. 6. Censorship and persecutions. 7. Repeated traumatic shocks and overtime sent on the population. For example, orders of closure issued at the last moment, sometimes even orders within orders. Paradoxical discourse. For example, in France, the government has been known to say everything and its opposite, sometimes within weeks of each other, without ever justifying what was said before. 8. Generalized anomalies. For example, incentives to professionals traditionally not licensed to perform injections, like the nutritionist or the physiotherapist or the psychologist for great profit. 9. Guilt tripping of individuals, seduction, blackmail, intimidation, threats, refusal of care of some category of the population, lack of education for children, disorganization of spatial and temporal benchmark for the entire world population, surveillance and transgression of people's intimate lives, etc. And this is an asymmetrical context where people have been subjected to the decisions of their leaders and where innocent people have been designated as guilty. For example, children designated as guilty of killing their grandmother. The citizen is treated like a prisoner on parole. The repeated traumatic shocks obtained in this way over time provoked both by political discourses and decisions, but also by the incessant suggestions in the mass media have led individuals in states of traumatic dissociation. It triggers a defense mechanism called denial in psychology, that is the impossibility of representing the violence of a situation that threatened the psychic life. The manipulations of the mass media playing on fear and panic have led to divisions in families, in couples, and in friendships, splitting society into two camps and causing distrust of all against all, from which it will now be very difficult to emerge in order to establish harmony between citizens. Don't we say divide and conquer? The mass media have operated a permanent hypnotic suggestion, reducing the individual to a mathematical unit, a number, or a positive or negative, positive case, negative case. In hypnosis, there is the hypnotic seal, which is very powerful induction that provokes a radical prohibition on thinking on the such and such a subject, like a drawer that is sealed in the psyche. A sect or cult requires adherence to a religious type of faith. The individual is not asked to analyze, but to believe blindly. Persecution and censorship, as well as intimidation, have fallen upon those who wanted to analyze and not believe. A sect or a cult always promises the return of a lost paradise. The same thing with the totalitarian system. A sect or a cult proposes fetish objects. Here, the Holy Grail was the injection, supposed to free us from evil. Of course, it was a lie. People who were injected twice today lose their rights in many countries if they refuse to pursue in this way. And we can clearly see that it is to lead us further towards a world of global planetary control and surveillance, where the individual will be reduced to nothing at best, to be used as a force of production, at worst, to be annihilated as useless to the capitalist reign. The totalitarian drift is of a sectarian and prophetic nature. Hannah Arendt said, the scientificity of totalitarian propaganda is characterized by the emphasis it places almost exclusively on scientific prophecy, as opposed to the more traditional reference to the past. The prophecy took place from the beginning with a completely unrealistic and unrealized prediction of the number of days, and I refer to the book I wrote with Vincent Pavin, professor of mathematics, Le débat interdit, the forbidden debate, which will be published at the beginning of March in France. The totalitarian system places the achievement of these goals in a future that it always distant, a kind of final promise, the return to a lost paradise, the end of the Calvary, the purity of the race, the territory purified of disease, the return to the world before, etc. It's a question of uniting the mass against a common enemy, here the virus, supposedly incarnating the opposition to the achievement of this goal. The enemy, both external and internal, will be susceptible to change. Ideological scientism and its predictive technique never cease to move. Their chameleon dimension keeps them in power. The discourse is no longer a reflection of the experience. It is the experience that must conform to the discourse. We started with predictive models, which we wanted to impose on reality. Let's think of Ferguson predictions in this case. In science, model must always be submitted to reality and not the contrary. French mathematics professor Vincent Pavant puts in this way in the book Le Débat Interdit. So the first postulate was established, Ferguson's models and the calculations that were based on them corresponded to reality. It is precisely from this moment that the collective delusion begins. The delusion of reality was established, and from then on, the postulate of the predominance of arbitrary figures resulting from modeling speculation was imposed instead of the statistical enumeration of the operational science, those that start from the facts and measures them. There has been a major scientific sin here with tragic consequences for humanity. It's necessary to understand why totalitarianism works on the populations. It works on the populations because in totalitarianism, there is a promise made. This is a promise that will not be kept, of course. The promise to the people is to take full responsibility of the suffering of their existence and they return to a lost paradise. This is what was set up at the beginning in Western countries. We take care of you completely. Stay at home. We pay you. Don't think anymore. We think for you. Get vaccinated and everything will go back to the way it was. Don't think, we think for you, etc. From the point of view of psychology, the profiles that instigate harassment are perverse and or paranoia profiles, so-called narcissistic profiles. But in the case of perversion, the criminal responsibility is engaged because there is no delusion constriction. While in the case of paranoia, the question is more debatable since it is a delusion of persecution. Nevertheless, the paranoiac individual is fully aware of harming. He even justifies it. He clearly intends to harm. And this intention is justified by a pseudo-ideal, the common good, health for all, etc. As we have already seen in former totalitarian regimes. The paranoiac does not necessarily believe in the content of his delusion. It's rather a way of being of the world, a way of persecuting where the other is seen as an enemy. And we can make the hypothesis that the instigators of this tragic development for the peoples have this relation to the world, a relation to the world made of anguish, of persecution, of narcissistic rigidity, in which the peoples are seen as enemies, a world population considered as too big and to be eliminated in some eugenistic perspectives. Clearly, the totalitarian system functions according to a pathological structure, which is one of paranoia. Mass psychosis is created by paranoia profiles, although it needs the alliance of different pathological profiles, notably the perverts, cynicism, instrumentalization. They are the ones who don't believe in the discourse of persecution, but generally they get considerably richer from the crisis that they have contributed to create, for example, for their only profits, and the psychopath mercenaries of the regime to continue to exist. The paranoiac delusion persecutes in the name of what is prophysis. And what is prophysis? It simply makes it happen. There will be a lot of deaths, it says. And in fact, by repeatedly prohibiting treatments that cure patients and making populations more precarious, these days are coming. Moreover, the ideological narrative justifies the persecutions by self-defense. With paranoia, it's allowed to kill because it was in self-defense. In paranoiac delusion, there are ideas of delusion hypochondria, and this is what leads to mass Munchausen syndrome, which is the inappropriate over-medicalization of a common viral disease, which would deserve proper and early care, denying the temperance, warnings, and experience of experts, and creating more problem and suffering than it solves. In the delusion hypochondria of paranoia, the disease is everywhere, experiences and as dangerous, deadly, the enemy of the living. The sick is opposed to the healthy, and the impure to the pure. Orders are given to eliminate the part of the social body designated as impure. The supposed impurity is to be hunted down by terror and radical methods. The end justifies the means. This is the reason why Hannah Arendt said, terror is constitutive of the totalitarian political body, just as legality is for the republican political body. The whole picture is a totalitarian drift. For political philosophy, particularly according to the work of Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, it is a matter of normalizing a state of exception in which human rights are suspended. The past prevents freedom of movement. It is a safe bet that the nature of these paths is aimed at controlling the movements of citizens, which will be reinvented in the name of other emergency, ecology, health, terrorism, manufactured in the name of the state of exception. Let us recall the political criteria of totalitarianism, which cannot be reduced to a dictatorship, a despotism, or tyranny. Monopoly of the mass media and the police force, central management of the economy, persecution of opponents and of any criticism, system of surveillance of individuals, encouragement of denunciations, concentrationary logic orchestrated on terror, clean slate policy, moving ideology built on the divisions between good citizens and bad citizens, on the enemy, visible or invisible, and purity. The totalitarian system is sustained by an ideology. That means a delusion belief which has no longer any link with logical truth or with the reality of experience, and which constantly needs to renew itself in its content in order to maintain an illegitimate power. The key instrument for the establishment of totalitarian power is first of all the harassment of minds, which must become permeable to the ideology. The media propaganda must obtain the division. of the collective, of the traditional clans, families, social classes, political clans, according to the paranoia cleavage between the good and the bad. Line of designation can evolve according to the chameleon ideology. Terror quickly intervenes through the designation of the enemy. Here, at the beginning, the enemy is an awful virus that intends to disseminate the human species and against which we are at war. Then the enemies become the disobedient who don't want to respect the so-called sanitary measures imposed by the political field. Propaganda, often masked behind subtle manipulations, it's for your own good, takes pleasure in creating collective traumatic shocks, for example, accounting of death repeated daily, which will then allow it to extend its control over the stunned and terrorized population, which under the effect of the paradoxical injunctions and the wear and tear will call the torturing power as a savior. Anywhere for its greatest misfortune that this so-called savior is at the same time the persecutor. Totalitarianism is international in its organization, universal in its ideological aim, and planetary in its political aspirations. It pursues the experiment of total domination, said Hannah Arendt. In front of this generalized violence and induced despair, the psyches are weakened. Many people fall into suicidal acts, perversions, or madness. Individuals who behave in a respectful way of the fundamental prohibitions can, in favor of a totalitarian ideology, regress, and in particular on a perverse mode. The deployment of the totalitarian system therefore leads to the occurrence of numerous abuses of power and sadistic acts committed by little chiefs who revel with themselves. And one wonders then how this good family man, usually so pleasant and known for so long, became capable of so many atrocities. In conclusion, Goebbels noted in his diary, in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was a certain rise in typhus, but measures were taken not to let them out of the ghetto. After all, Jews have always been carriers of contagious disease. They must either be herded into a ghetto and left on their own, or they must be eliminated. Otherwise, they will always contaminate the healthy population of civilized states. It's important to mention that we have already had to deal with the sanitary ideology of an epidemiological type in the not so distant past with the typhus epidemic, which the Nazi claimed to be fighting and eradicating. It is indeed the deployment of this hunt for the typhus epidemic that designates a category of the population as being carriers of it and treat them as epidemic propagating parasites. The typhus epidemic was spreading because all the conditions were there for it. Distribution of bedbug-infested blankets, crowding in unsanitary ghettos, etc. In an article entitled The Germs of a Fascist International While Everyone is Claiming Victory and Never Again, Hannah Arendt, on the still smoldering ashes of the war, immediately announces the dangers of tomorrow in the guise of a Nazi international, which would infiltrate the post-war institutions in the manner of an occult sect within the after-war institutions and may come back even through the creation of Europe. That is to say that at the very moment when European populations thought they had gotten rid of the awful beast, the philosopher warns it could happen again and much worse. In the totalitarian system, the living is the enemy. The individual is reduced at best to a number. The language is corrupted so that individuals can no longer think about what happens to them. For example, the asymptomatic sick people. This expression means nothing. Or the addition of a new vocabulary in the media, no less than 60 new words or expressions. The goal is no longer alienation, but the annihilation of the human subject. And for that, it's necessary to break all spontaneity. Totalitarianism is by essence genocidal. It does not need the human anymore, or rather, it pretends to create him again from scratch. The new man to whom it's necessary to suppress the freedom to make reign the tyrannical and unhealthy ideal of purity. Transhumanism, which is a modern form of the Nazi Superman, is the pure and simple negation of human rights. The term transhumanism was invented in the 1940 by Aldous Huxley's brother to replace the term eugenics. The apology of the powerful body, of the will of the power, of the transhumanized Superman supposes the elimination of the supposedly useless of the sick and suffering bodies. Totalitarian regimes always use science, or we should rather say scientism, to establish a pseudo-legitimacy for their existence and demand a kind of religious fervor toward this scientism. The current crisis is the reign of the god of mathematics. Hannah Arendt said that propaganda is no longer an objective problem about which people can have an opinion, but has become in their lives an element as real and intangible as the rules of arithmetic. However, I must remind you that it is impossible to apply mathematical, statistical, biological concepts to the human politic, moral, and spiritual experience. If we accept that mathematics, that statistics run our human existence, we are reduced to numbers, to positive, to negative, positive case, negative case, and we can therefore be eliminated without any remorse. The discipline that thinks about human political, moral, and spiritual experience is philosophy, especially moral and political philosophy and metaphysics. The human being is sacred. Human life is sacred. In other words, it's impossible to apply scientific concepts coming from the so-called hard science, which, it should be remembered, are science of dead matter, to the human, political, moral, and spiritual experience. The scientific approach carried beyond its limits becomes inhuman and is then used to try to justify approaches that are in reality neither scientific nor human. Let us quote the writer Kessler, who testifies to the methods of recruitment of the totalitarian experience that he himself lived in this book, Darkness at Moon. There are only two conceptions of human morality, and there are at opposite poles. One is Christian and humanitarian, declaring the individual sacred and asserting that the rules of arithmetic should not apply to human units, which in our equation represent either 0 or infinity. The other conception starts from the fundamental principle that a collective end justifies all means and not only allows but requires that the individual be in any case subordinated and sacrificed to the community, which can dispose of him either as a guinea pig to be used in an experiment or as a lamb to be offered in sacrifice. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariane. Dexter, do we have questions? I think we do. Anna. I have a question, or I have a couple of questions if you allow me. Both of you seem to agree that this is not just happening, but this is something that other people have invented, and this is now a worldwide concerted effort going on. Is that correct? What kind of people do this? I know I've asked this question before, but how can anyone go beyond what we would consider empathy, for example, and humanity, and believe in sacrificing individuals for the greater good? What kind of people are we dealing with? Are we dealing with psychopaths who are still capable of understanding what they're doing and controlling what they're doing?
I think that a psychopath understands very well the difference between right and wrong, but they have a spiritual problem of the conscience. The conscience is what makes us human. And they can tell the difference between right and wrong. They're not crazy at all, but their conscience doesn't feel the weight of the guilt that the rest of us would feel, those of us who are capable of feeling empathy. Over the years, sometimes psychopaths have commented on my videos and they have openly said that they feel superior to other people because they're not bothered by that empathy and sense of guilt.
So there is a certain megalomania involved in this. They think they're much better than anyone else, and that's why they can do whatever they want with individuals.
The grandiosity and the entitlement that they should get away with it.
Yeah. That is what criminals who commit very gruesome deeds usually have in common, don't they?
You know, the interesting thing, though, is that when the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatry, describes the narcissistic personality disorder and the antisocial personality disorder as the overt types, the obvious types, the criminals who get caught and go to jail. They don't describe in the scientific literature the covert types who are very sophisticated and, in my opinion, far more dangerous because of how hidden they are and how far they can go in society because of that.
Does that mean that those who are pulling the strings are no more dangerous than those who are helping them, the ones whose strings are being pulled?
So those would be the enablers. And the thing about an abusive system, so you can even look at a family unit or society in general, but any abusive system is formed of abusers and enablers. And it's actually the enablers that keep that system functioning. The abusers need the enablers to do that bidding for them.
I will speak in French. Tout le monde ne recherche pas le pouvoir.
No, I can't.
Yeah.
I cannot. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Si.
I'm sorry, I was muted, so I couldn't translate. I'm going to translate what Rainer was asking. Okay. So it seems that both of you, Ariane, il semble que toi et Meredith, vous êtes d'accord. Ce que Rainer veut savoir, c'est qui sont ces gens? Est-ce que ce sont des psychopathes? Voilà, c'est à peu près les mêmes questions qu'il a posées la dernière fois. Qui sont ces gens-là? Et voilà. Meredith, si tu as quelque chose à rajouter que j'aurais oublié, mais en gros, c'est ça.
Bon. Tout le monde ne recherche pas le pouvoir. Les profils qui recherchent le pouvoir sont essentiellement les paranoïaques et les pervers. Ça, il faut que tu traduises.
Not everybody is looking for power, but essentially paranoiac and pervert.
Ce sont des troubles narcissiques. On peut mettre la psychopathie, perversion, paranoïa. Ce sont des troubles narcissiques graves.
It is a narcissistic trouble, a serious one,
Ils n'ont pas, dans leur construction psychologique, développé l'altérité.
And they have not developed in their psychic development togetherness.
Alterity aussi.
Authority or togetherness.
Mm-hmm. How do we get out of this? Is it
Comment sortons-nous de là?
In my view, it is important for the people to understand what's going on, to see the whole picture. Is there any other way? Because to me, that is the only way to make people see what is really going on. And only if they can see and understand what is going on, can they stand up and fight this.
Pour moi, ce qui est important, c'est que les gens voient le grand tableau. Hein, voilà, c'est ce que dit Rainer. Il faudrait voir le grand tableau pour que les gens comprennent.
Alors, Hannah Arendt disait que le totalitarisme s'arrête quand les masses cessent de croire.
So Hannah Arendt said that totalitarianism stops when the masses stop to believe blindly, basically. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's when enough people start to see the truth.
Mm-hmm.
S'il n'y a pas de participation de la société civile, il n'y a pas de totalitarisme.
If the society, the people in the society don't participate, there is no totalitarianism.
Yes, is...
Yeah, but for this they also have to know, and that's maybe why we see this intense efforts of like censorship right now, because it's becoming a little bit dangerous, like, you know, the amount of people speaking out now or meeting on the streets, and that's what you think also.
Yes, I think also that is more and more censorship, and the media that made so much work that it's really difficult for us to manage to give the truth. Yeah, so I think it's a main problem we have now.
Yeah, donc c'est vraiment la censure qui est le principal problème actuellement.
Et les médias grand public, ils font un travail de sape énorme.
And the mainstream media is the main issue, and the censorship.
Et
I think
il y a une barrière psychologique pour les gens, c'est de penser que leurs gouvernants leur veulent du mal.
Well, there's a blockages because they have a really difficult time to conceive that some other people wants to harm them.
I think one of the biggest challenges is the cognitive dissonance, because even if the censorship didn't exist to control the information, to control the reality, even if people had access to that information, it's so difficult for them to even face the truth in that state. And something really important that Ariane mentioned earlier was the deprivation of human rights and how human rights are suspended. And the trick that all abusers do, and what keeps people in the abuse, is that they want to destroy your self-worth. They have to flatten your self-worth. They have to make you believe that you are not worthy of your basic human rights. And what is at assault here, it's not just the vaccine, and it is compliance. They want to violate our consent. And that is going to be the theme that's going to continue in the next pandemic and the next crisis that they manufacture or take advantage of all the way to the Great Reset. So the self-worth is so important for the individual to rebuild. Otherwise, they're not going to believe that they're worthy of those basic human rights.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, Dexter.
No, it's, thank you, Raina. You've mentioned something very, very important, and that is, Ms. Miller, you were mentioning consent. I mean, when we look at a Nuremberg Code, we look at a Helsinki Declaration, we look at natural law, whatever, it all comes down to consent. So for me, it seems to me that they are actually, this is definitely a psychological whole, but then it's a psychological whole with the main emphasis to actually get voluntary consent from the populace. And what it will then ultimately come to, and I can already foresee that this can be a possible defense when we actually pursue this further. And that is to say, no, we just gave them the information, and with that information, they've actually given consent. But from a psychological point of view, when it comes now to that consent, that was definitely granted on the basis of the psychological warfare that was conducted on the populace. Will you not agree?
That's correct. And that's what every abuser does in a relationship. They tell you without telling you what they're doing. So then they can say, well, I told you and you knew all along, because they don't accept any accountability for their actions. The more sophisticated, the more covert the abuser is, the more they need your voluntary consent. But as I think it was Virginie that mentioned earlier today, it's not real consent. Because when people are not provided with the true information, they don't realize deception is taking place. They're not giving real consent. That was a trick. That was a ruse to get them to consent to something that was a deception all along.
So obviously, the mass media is playing a massive role when it comes to getting people to a point to consent, to put them in that mind space.
Yeah, so that's the whole thing, is the abuser's equation is problem, reaction, solution. And so this is a bit what Brian Garrison was talking about last weekend with the applied behavioral psychology, where they provoke, first there's a problem. So they either manufacture a problem or crisis, or they take advantage of one that's already happening. And then they provoke your emotion, whether it's fear, for example. And then by provoking that emotion, they can almost predict what your behavioral response is going to be, so they can drive you to a predetermined solution. And the most sophisticated abusers will make you beg for that solution and think that it was your idea all along.
So this basically then brings me to follow the signs. Because when you listen to all of the talking heads, they will, and even the medical doctors like Dr. Fauci, one of the defendants, they will always repetitively actually mention follow the signs. And that's then to put the populace in a specific mindset to say, you can trust me. I know what I am doing, and I will do no harm to you. But obviously that's not the case.
And that was one, if we take a look at that Yale study, that was one of the emotional manipulation tactics they used, is trust in science. And so when you hear Fauci say, I am science, and if you don't believe me, you don't believe in science, that those catchphrases, it's like a whole download of information that triggers an emotional reaction and then a behavioral response.
Okay. Thank you.
I had one question, just a very brief one. And Meredith, you mentioned something, an excellent presentation by both of you, by the way. It was very nice how it dovetailed together and really enhanced one another. But Meredith, you mentioned something about in the Stockholm syndrome, the perceived life threat. And then you gave an example of people who are either fearing the virus or other people. And at the opposite end of that spectrum were people who are fearing tyranny. And that made me think that maybe none of us really, as much as we think we know what might be going on, none of us has escaped some of this psychological terrorism that has been going on across the globe. Is that a fair statement?
For sure. I will admit, I've also been in this state periodically throughout the time that's gone on. And I think that we all have experienced moments of that. Perhaps some people spend more time in that state than others. And some of us are able to get back up into those higher states of consciousness because of working on healing our own traumas in our life. But otherwise, it's very difficult to get out of that state. And really, no one is completely immune to that. But the self-worth is really the greatest immunity to abuse and manipulation, because it really makes you question what people are trying to get you to do and what is their intention.
That's a great key. I'm sorry, you probably need to translate, but that's a great key, the self-worth. And that's where we need to maybe empower people. And that's one of the things I think we're doing by empowering them with knowledge and the self-worth, that they are worthy humans to have human rights.
I think a big part of the self-worth, how can people find self-worth, is setting boundaries. So then the knowledge is not going to change their self-worth. Knowing that they're human and that they have inalienable rights, the God-given rights from birthright to human rights, this means nothing to a person who's caught in that state. So the only way to start rebuilding self-worth is to evaluate what most matters to you, take inventory of your values, and then set boundaries to protect those. And every time you set a boundary, like no, and no is a complete sentence, and only manipulators keep pushing and pushing once you said no, right? So when a person sets that boundary, they start rebuilding their self-worth naturally.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Ariane would like to talk, and for some reason she has been muted. So if there is something that can be done so she can also answer. Oh, okay, here you are, Ariane. They were talking there, I think it was Rainer or Dexter, I think it was Dexter that talked about the emphasis on consent. That's what you said, Dexter?
That's correct, yeah, from a psychological point of view. And I think for you, if you can bring it from a totalitarian point of view, that will be awesome. That will be
yes.
great. Thank you.
Can you talk about, Ariane, est-ce que tu peux parler du consentement du point de vue psychologique avec le totalitarisme?
En fait, le harceleur recherche la soumission de sa victime.
The harasser look for submission of his victim.
Et pour cela, elle ne peut pas se mettre en opposition, c'est contre-productif pour lui.
So he cannot be in opposition. It's counterproductive for him.
Il doit amener à faire en sorte que la victime fasse quelque chose qu'elle n'aurait pas fait si elle n'avait pas été harcelée.
He must push the victim to do something that we will not have done if he wasn't harassed.
C'est pour ça qu'il y a manipulation.
Ordinarily. That's why there is manipulation.
Le syndrome de Stockholm, c'est un moment où la victime ne peut pas échapper à son harceleur.
The Stockholm syndrome is a time that the victim cannot escape to the harasser.
Elle est prise au piège.
The victim is trapped.
Et donc, il y a un mécanisme de survie.
Therefore, there is a mechanism of survival.
Où la victime va anticiper ce que veut son bourreau.
So therefore, the victim is going to anticipate what wants his perpetrator.
Pour essayer que
what the perpetrators wants.
Pour essayer de survivre.
To try to survive.
Et donc, elle va se mettre dans le cerveau de son bourreau.
So it's like the victim is going to be in the brain, in the brain.
Et c'est à ce moment-là qu'elle va en même temps rencontrer la souffrance de son bourreau.
And at the same time, when the victim is going to meet the suffering of his perpetrator, encounter the suffering of his perpetrator.
Et ensuite, comme pour nous, le mécanisme de survie.
Can I ask a question, Ariane? Is it for this reason that sometimes we see people surpassing what is expected? For example, masks in the car, masks everywhere, even if it's not mandatory. It's for this reason?
Virginie, tu peux le dire en français?
Oui, il ne faut pas.
Je voulais dire que, est-ce que c'est... pardon. Est-ce que c'est ça que l'on voit parfois des gens qui vont au-delà de ce qu'on leur demande, à savoir porter le masque dans la voiture, partout, même quand ils sont seuls. C'est pour cette raison, ils vont au-delà de ce que demande le bourreau, en fait.
C'est un mécanisme de survie. Si on plaît au bourreau, peut-être il va nous épargner.
It's a mechanism of survival. If we please the perpetrator, maybe we're going to be safe. We're going to be safe.
Et donc après, il y a un mécanisme. Nous effaçons toujours les événements désagréables que nous avons vécus. Tout le monde efface.
And then there's another mechanism. We always erase, forget what wasn't pleasant.
Et donc, la victime ne garde plus que l'empathie pour son bourreau.
And therefore, the victim keeps only the empathy for her perpetrator.
Et c'est d'autant plus facile que le bourreau manie des discours paradoxaux.
And it's much easier. It's much more easier because the perpetrator used paradoxical discourses.
C'est pour ton bien.
It's for your own good.
Je t'aime. Etc.
I love you. It's for you.
So what we have here, if we talk about a solution, we have to not just understand rationally what is going on, and that's probably what we have to do to show the whole picture so that people see what's going on. But it's not enough to see this rationally. We also need to overcome what one of you called, I think it was you, Meredith, spiritual bankruptcy. We have to understand that there's something out there that's worthwhile fighting for. Either a loved one or spirituality or religion, whatever. But it takes not just rational understanding of what's going on, but it's also important to overcome this spiritual bankruptcy. That's a great term.
Yeah, and like you said...
I'm sorry. So what Rainier said, it's not enough to... Huh? Pardon. Nous devons trouver donc une solution, non pas seulement comprendre les choses rationnellement, mais nous devons aussi comprendre l'aspect spirituel et voir au point où nous avons été, finalement, nous avons négligé l'aspect spirituel. Hein?
Rainer, you mentioned how sometimes if people thought of their children or their grandchildren or their creator or something beyond themselves.
Exactly.
And that is often a very helpful motivation, because what gets the person off the floor? You know, humanity is on the floor right now for the most part, and that is the victim in an abusive relationship. Nobody can lift that person up. You can pick them up and they're going to fall right back down. They have to find it within themselves. But like you said, that spark for them, what reignites their soul and their spirit after this kind of abuse is something beyond themselves that motivates them to get up, because they don't believe they're worth it. But is there something else that's worth it?
That's very well put. That's easy to understand now. Thank you.
Je pense que ce qui est compliqué, c'est que quand on a des victimes de harcèlement, on doit couper le lien au harceleur, et ça n'est pas possible.
So what is complicated here, it's usually in a relationship with harasser, and a victim, usually the solution is to cut the bond with the harasser. But here it's not possible.
Mhm.
Mais les gens peuvent le faire quand même un petit peu, déjà en coupant les médias.
But people can do it a little bit first by turn it off the media, the TV.
Donc, ce qui est très important, c'est de proposer, comme nous le faisons, d'autres discours en nommant, comme l'a dit ma collègue, la relation d'abus, la transgression.
So if I understand, okay. So what we need to do is name what you said, and it's name things. And what else? Qu'est-ce que tu as dit d'autre?
De proposer d'autres discours qui nomment la relation de transgression.
So what we need is we need to hear other discourses that name things and offer other way.
Virginie.
I have a question on this point. It's about the philanthropic Bill Gates. We heard at the beginning of the session, and you say, Dr. Bilheran, that paranoia profile is aware that he's arming, and he has the intention of arming because there's no delusion construction. When Bill Gates says that he's sad because he is not successful in vaccinating all the world, what do you think? He knows that he is arming people by financing everything, for example?
C'est compliqué, alors, parce que j'aimerais beaucoup expertiser Bill Gates, mais le récit, est-ce qu'il croit au récit qu'il a proposé? Si nous sommes dans ce genre de pathologie, il n'y a pas d'inscription de vrai et de faux. C'est-à-dire que nous sommes bien en deçà dans la construction psychologique de la capacité de distinguer le vrai et le faux. Donc d'avoir un discours et une compréhension, une capacité, même si ça a l'air rationnel.
Translate that. We're gonna break down. On va couper ça en plusieurs choses. So you said it's complicated. You would like to talk about Bill Gates. So can you repeat, just because I got confused, if you're in this kind of pathology of it's go beyond good and bad, that's what you said, ça va au-delà du bien et du mal? Qu'est-ce que tu as dit, Ariane?
Non, j'ai dit que dans la construction, si nous avons affaire par exemple, à une construction de type paranoïaque, il n'y a pas accès au vrai et au faux, à la capacité de discerner le vrai et le faux, c'est-à-dire qu'en fait...
Okay. So if we're talking about paranoid profile, which is the case here, they don't have access, we don't have access to the notion of right and wrong. Is it that?
Et pas plus que bien et mal, oui. C'est-à-dire que l'imaginaire est confondu avec la réalité. Tout est confondu.
The imagination is confused with a reality.
La personne dit quelque chose un jour et le lendemain autre chose, l'inverse.
The person think one thing one day and it will do the opposite next day.
Mais le rapport au monde reste un rapport de harcèlement et de persécution, avec une intention de harceler.
But the connection with the world is still a connection of persecution.
Et donc, on a l'éternelle question entre la philosophie et le droit. Pour nous, l'éternelle question entre la psychologie et le droit, pour nous, les psys, on peut tout expliquer. Mais le droit doit poser des limites.
So we still have this dilemma between philosophy and right.
No, psychology and right.
Psychology and right. And
en psychologie, on peut tout expliquer.
In psychology, we can explain everything.
Mais il faut poser des limites. Et
we need to set limits.
Et tous les profils harceleurs sont soit pervers, soit paranoïaques.
And all the perverse harassing profile are pervert or paranoiac.
C'est-à-dire avec une difficulté, une impossibilité de respecter l'autre.
An incapacity to respect others, the others.
Une incapacité à contrôler ses pulsions.
An incapacity to control the urges, the pulsion, urges.
Une incapacité à réellement être capable de discerner le vrai du faux.
An incapacity to clearly define the wrong and the right.
Et une incapacité à distinguer le bien et le mal.
The good and the bad, evil or bad or good.
Mm-hmm. I like to take solace or even courage in the recognition that it doesn't take 80% or 70% or even 50% of the people to turn this thing around. Rather, I tend to believe that only a few good men and women under these circumstances are capable of turning this thing around. You don't need the masses. The reason why I'm saying this is because the masses who seem to be under the influence of mass formation are not capable of any real activities. They can only react to what they're being told. We, on the other hand, are the ones, we who are in this group right now, and probably most of the people who are watching this, most of our jury, we have already asked questions. We have already come to the conclusion that there's something wrong here. That's why I think that it is not important to get the masses behind us, but only a few good men and women, maybe 5%, maybe 10%. Is that a correct assumption?
The critical mass, I think is what you're saying. What is that critical mass? And I think there's going to be some people that will never wake up. I think some people will take this to their grave. And I think that it's actually okay, that we don't have to try to convert everyone or wake everybody up. In fact, that's even disrespectful to try to confront somebody who doesn't want to listen to what we're saying. But I do think you're right that at a certain point, I don't know what the number is, that critical mass will create some kind of shift and also invite some kind of intervention from beyond, perhaps, that will assist us in this process.
Thank you.
En psychologie sociale, on a eu quand même beaucoup d'expériences de soumission à l'autorité avec Milgram, avec la prison de Stanford. Au début, on est plutôt aux alentours de 1%.
1%.
So what you said in social psychology, it's rather around 1%. That's what.
Avec l'expérience de Milgram ou la prison de Stanford, par exemple, sur la soumission à l'autorité.
So tu dis que 1% c'est suffisant pour faire basculer les choses?
Non, je dis que c'est 1% qui est capable de résister dans les expériences de psychologie.
So it's 1% that is capable of resisting. 1%.
Avec les expériences connues de Milgram et de la prison de Stanford, par exemple.
Based on the Milgram experience.
More than
We have
1%.
actually much more than that because the party Die Basis has already they made up almost gained almost 800,000 votes, and these are clearly like anti-measures people, and then there's much more anti-measures people who have never heard of this party, for instance, or like just didn't vote for them. So I think in Germany, at least, the situation has reached much more than those 1%.
distinguer le début de l'expérience et la suite. Les 1%, c'est le début de l'expérience de la soumission à l'autorité. En mars 2020, combien étions-nous?
Well, it's just at the beginning of the experience that was made on the submission of authority. At that point, they found out it was just one person that could resist, you know? So it was based on the study, the Milgram study.
But resistance is also infectious. Also, so
Yeah.
More than the virus.
Correct.
Well, thank you very much. I don't want to cut anyone off. Anna or Dexter? I was thinking that...
no more questions.
Yeah, I was thinking that was encouraging. So why not end on that note for today?